The Galactic Council dismissed humans as beasts, until they became the ones being hunted. The first formal contact between humanity and the Galactic Accord took place not with fanfare, not with orbital bombardment, and not with the dramatic first contact protocols that Earth's governments had been quietly rehearsing for 60 years. It happened in a parking garage in Geneva on a Tuesday afternoon, when a Velhari diplomat named Sarakai walked through the wrong door and nearly had a heart attack stepping over a pigeon. He didn't have a heart technically, but the biological equivalent ceased for 3 full seconds. The pigeon didn't move. That image, that single, stupid, fearless pigeon, was included in Sarakai's preliminary report to the Accord's First Assessment Bureau. It was buried in a footnote, the way diplomatic footnotes often contain the truths nobody wants to headline. Local fauna display no fear response to sapient contact. Possible indicator of endemic desensitization across species. The Bureau reviewed Sarakai's 47-page report in about 11 minutes. They were efficient. They had been cataloging new civilizations for roughly 9,000 years, and humanity's file, cross-referenced against their taxonomic index of sapient life, generated a score that placed them in Category 4. Emergent Biological Intelligence, Pre-Cooperative Stage, High Aggression Index. Category 4 civilizations were, in the Bureau's experience, problems to be managed. The Accord didn't hate humans. That would have required them to consider humans worth hating. What they felt, if felt, was even the right word for Velhari cognition, was closer to the low-grade concern one might feel discovering a wasp nest near the garden door. Unpleasant. Potentially dangerous. Best addressed before it became an issue. The formal delegation arrived 8 months later. 3 Velhari ships, sleek, silver-gray, built for diplomacy rather than war, which was itself a subtle message, settled into parking orbit above Earth and requested a frequency for transmission. The UN Secretary-General at the time was a woman named Adiz Okonkwo. She had spent 30 years in conflict mediation. She had negotiated ceasefires between governments that had been shelling each other's civilians for decades. She had, in her own words, sat across the table from men who believed God had personally endorsed their atrocities. She was the wrong person to condescend to. The Velhari opening address lasted 40 minutes. It was, in its structure, a masterclass in polite demotion. It acknowledged humanity's remarkable developmental progress. It praised Earth's biological diversity and chemical complexity. It offered the Accord's guidance framework for species in humanity's developmental stage. It used the phrase nascent civilization 7 times. Secretary-General Okonkwo let them finish. She had a habit, her staff knew, of going very still when she was angry. She went very still. Then she said in a voice that had talked warlords out of artillery campaigns, "I'd like to understand your classification system. Specifically, what criteria placed us in Category 4 rather than Category 3? There was a pause from the Velhari delegation. Not a long one, they were professionals, but it was there. They hadn't expected the question. More precisely, they hadn't expected her to know there was a Category 3. She'd had 8 months. The answer the Velhari gave was diplomatic, layered, and ultimately honest. Humanity scored high on what the Accord called instability metrics. Their recorded history was saturated with organized violence. They had, within living memory, come within minutes of nuclear self-annihilation on at least 3 documented occasions. They lacked a unified government. They had not achieved faster-than-light travel, had not colonized beyond their own moon in any permanent sense, and showed persistent inability to cooperate at the species level on long-term existential threats. Your own climate data, the lead Velhari diplomat said, not unkindly, suggests a civilization that knows it is in danger and continues behaviors that accelerate that danger. This is a marker the Bureau has observed before. It does not typically resolve well. Okonkwo nodded slowly. And the species that display this marker, what happens to them? They are given the Accord's guidance. Resource management. Conflict mediation. Structural support for cooperative governance. Supervised, she said. Assisted, he corrected. She looked at him for a long moment. Tell me about the species in Category 3. The Velhari diplomat, his name was Esaveth, she would later learn, and he was considered among the best in his field, shifted in a way that, to a trained human observer, looked almost like discomfort. Category 3 civilizations have demonstrated cross-system cooperation, stable unified governance, resource sustainability above 70%, and a measured aggression index within Accord acceptable parameters. Measured, she said. Acceptable. Yes. By whom? Another pause. Longer this time. The meeting lasted 6 more hours. Humanity was formally registered with the Accord as a Category 4 civilization, pending reassessment in 50 standard cycles, roughly 62 Earth years. They were assigned a developmental liaison. They were offered a seat on the Accord's junior advisory panel, which had no voting rights, no veto authority, and no binding recommendation power. Okonkwo accepted all of it with the graciousness of a woman who had just been handed a game board and was already memorizing the rules. What the Accord did not know, what they had no framework to understand, was that humanity had spent its entire existence being underestimated. By rivals, by colonizers, by each other. The instinct to survive categorization, to endure condescension, to keep moving inside whatever cage had been built around it, that was perhaps the most human thing there was. Dr. Yusuf Aslan, the MIT xenolinguist who had spent 4 years preparing for first contact and had been one of the junior translators in that room, wrote in his private journal that night. They think they've filed us away. They think this is administration. They have never encountered a species that spent 10,000 years figuring out how to outlast every system that tried to contain it. They will. Back in orbit, aboard the lead diplomatic vessel, Esaveth wrote his own report. It was professional, precise, and almost entirely accurate. He noted humanity's unusual linguistic flexibility. He noted Okonkwo's negotiating posture. He flagged several of her follow-up questions as unusually procedurally sophisticated for a first contact exchange. He included a recommendation for elevated monitoring. It was, his superiors would later acknowledge, the correct call. It was also by then too late to matter. What the Bureau's assessment model couldn't quantify, what 9,000 years of cataloging civilizations had never needed to quantify, was what happened to a species that had been told, for its entire history, that it wasn't enough. That it was too violent, too chaotic, too fractured to be taken seriously. What happened was, it listened, and then it got to work. His name, rendered in the closest phonetic approximation human vocal cords could manage, was something like Thavranes. He asked the humans assigned to liaise with him to call him Tove. They did, with the easy adaptability that would later be catalogued, by him, specifically, as one of humanity's most disarming traits. Tove was 43 years into a distinguished career with the Accord's Developmental Affairs Division. He had overseen the guided integration of 11 civilizations. 6 of them had successfully graduated to Category 3 within 2 assessment cycles. One had collapsed inward from resource depletion before his intervention could gain traction, a professional failure he still thought about. The remaining 4 were progressing, slowly, as most things progressed slowly in a galaxy that measured time in centuries. He arrived on Earth in the 3rd month after the Geneva Accords were signed, and he brought with him a staff of 4, a portable atmosphere modulator. Earth's air was breathable for Velhari but uncomfortably humid and dense with particulates, and 47 data tablets containing what the Bureau called a civilizational uplift framework. Dr. Mara Vasquez, the UN's appointed human liaison, met him at the designated facility outside of Nairobi, a low building set in a quiet landscape, deliberately chosen for its distance from any seat of power, a neutrality signal the Accord's Protocol Division had recommended. She was 38 years old, held doctorates in both international law and cognitive anthropology, and had been chosen because she was, in the words of the selection committee, exceptionally good at hearing what people aren't saying. Tove found her difficult to read. This was unusual. Velhari were among the most socially perceptive species in the Accord. Their politics had been conducted through layered subtext for so long that reading emotional states was essentially a professional prerequisite. But Vasquez had a stillness that he couldn't parse. Not coldness. Not neutrality. Something more like density, as if she was thinking several conversations ahead and had chosen to inhabit only one of them. He would later identify this as a common human trait among experienced negotiators. He would later still wish he had identified it earlier. The first 3 months were almost pleasant. Tove presented the uplift framework in sessions that had been designed to feel collaborative rather than instructional, a refinement from earlier Bureau methodology, which had tended to produce resentment. Vasquez engaged with every module. She asked questions that were precise and well-researched. She flagged inconsistencies in the framework's assumptions with the mild tone of someone making a suggestion rather than a challenge. One afternoon, 6 weeks in, she said, "The framework assumes that cross-regional resource sharing is a problem of political will rather than structural incentive. But looking at Earth's economic history, the failures of cooperative resource management almost always trace back to incentive misalignment rather than ideological opposition. Has the Bureau considered that distinction?" Tove had been asked variations of this question before by other civilizations. Usually it came with an edge, a defensive posturing, a resistance to being guided. Vasquez asked it the way a graduate student might ask a professor about a gap in a textbook. Genuinely curious, non-confrontational, and, he slowly realized, completely right. He reviewed the module that evening. She was correct. The framework had a structural assumption baked in from a civilization type that operated on strong centralized governance, and that assumption had been applied without adjustment to Earth's deeply decentralized political reality. He sent a correction flag to the Bureau. This was not unusual. Frameworks were updated based on field data. What was unusual was the note he included. The human liaison identified a structural error in Module 7C within 6 weeks of review. No previous Category 4 civilization has generated a framework correction within the first assessment year. Recommend elevated engagement tier. The Bureau acknowledged the note and did not change the engagement tier. This was also not unusual. The Bureau was large, and recommendations from individual liaisons tended to queue behind more pressing assessments. Tove began quietly to keep his own notes. By the end of the first year, he had accumulated 63 such notes. They covered the speed at which human institutions were already adapting Bureau frameworks into their own policy architectures, the way human scientists were cross-referencing Accord technical disclosures with their own existing research and, in several cases, arriving at conclusions the Accord hadn't shared yet, and a recurring pattern in Vasquez's questioning that he could only describe in his private file as reverse engineering the assessment criteria. She wasn't just learning the framework. She was learning what the framework was looking for. He brought this up to her directly one evening, in the spare language that the Velhari used when they wanted to communicate without diplomatic layering. You're not trying to pass the reassessment. You're trying to understand what passing the reassessment means within the Accord's decision architecture. Vasquez looked at him. That dense, forward-leaning stillness. Isn't that the same thing? For most civilizations, yes. And for us. He considered the question for a long time. For you, he said finally, understanding the system seems to be a precondition for engaging with it. You appear constitutionally unwilling to participate in a process you don't fully understand. She smiled, a small genuine one. We call it informed consent. It is something more than that. Maybe, she said. Or maybe we've just had a lot of practice with systems that weren't built for us. Tove returned to his quarters and added a 64th note. The human liaison's comment today suggests that their engagement with the Accord's framework may be, at the civilizational level, less an act of compliance and more an act of study. I do not yet know what they intend to do with what they are learning. I believe I should find out before the Bureau does. He never sent that note. He sat with it for 3 days and then, in a decision he would spend a long time examining, he archived it in a private file that existed only on his personal device. He wasn't sure why he protected it. He told himself it was because the hypothesis was unconfirmed. He knew, with the part of his cognition that had been reading people for 43 years, that it was something else. Something closer to respect. Something closer to recognition. He had been sent to supervise a civilization. He was beginning to suspect he had been assigned to witness one. The Karev Station incident was not, technically, humanity's fault. This was the conclusion of the Accord's Joint Review Board after a 14-month investigation, and it was also the most carefully worded document in the board's recorded history, because it had to simultaneously be accurate, avoid establishing precedent, and not say anything that would require the Bureau to reclassify humanity. Here is what happened, stripped of diplomatic language. Karev Station was a refueling and cargo transit hub in the outer belt of the Saharan system, about 40 light-years from Earth. It was controlled by the Drevithi Syndicate, a commercial governance body roughly analogous to a trading company that had acquired the rights to manage the station from the Accord approximately 200 years prior. The Drevithi were Category 2. They had voting rights on the Accord's Commercial Affairs Panel. They were, in every formal sense, a protected and respected member civilization. They were also, in practice, running a narcotics trafficking operation out of Karev Station's lower levels that had been quietly tolerated by the Accord for 60 years because the Drevithi's vote on the Commercial Affairs Panel was often the deciding margin on resource allocation for several Category 4 civilizations, including, as of approximately 14 months prior to the incident, Earth. Humanity had not been told this. Captain Yemi Adiyinka of the UES Resolute, the first human deep space vessel to be granted transit rights through Accord space, discovered the trafficking operation by accident. She had been directed to Karev Station for a scheduled fuel exchange and diplomatic courtesy call. Her ship's bioscan systems, which were calibrated for human medical monitoring and were frankly better than anything the Accord had expected from a Category 4 build, detected a chemical compound in the station's lower cargo bay that matched a Class 4 neurological suppressant on Earth's controlled substances list. She sent a query to the station's administrative office. The administrative office told her the compound was a regulated pharmaceutical in transit. She requested documentation. They provided documentation. The documentation was, to anyone not familiar with Drevithi commercial transit law, entirely convincing. Adiinka had a forensic accountant on her crew, a woman named Dr. Lena Fisher who had spent 12 years working financial crime investigation for Interpol before the Deep Space program. Fisher spent 4 hours with the documentation and then handed Adiinka a summary that could be compressed to 6 words. These numbers do not add up. Adiinka did the correct thing. She flagged it through the official Accord liaison channel, submitted all documentation and requested guidance. The guidance took 9 days to arrive. This was within normal processing parameters. In those 9 days, because Adiinka was the kind of captain she was, she kept her bioscan running and her logs detailed. On day 6, a Drevithi security team boarded the Resolute for what they described as a routine inspection authorized under Accord Transit Protocol 7. Adiinka permitted the boarding, she had to, under treaty, but she also had her crew awake at stations and recording everything. The security team spent 40 minutes searching the ship. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. But they spent 11 of those 40 minutes in the communications room, which was where the logs were stored. When the guidance from the Accord finally arrived, it advised Adiinka to defer to Drevithi Administrative Authority on matters of local commercial regulation. She responded with a 400-word memo that documented the boarding, the time spent in the communications room, and the timestamps that showed the Drevithi had accessed, not copied apparently but accessed, the log index. She ended the memo. I want to be precise about what I'm reporting. I'm not making an accusation. I am documenting a sequence of events and requesting clarification on whether this sequence is within normal parameters. If it is, I would appreciate understanding what parameters we are operating under. If it is not, I would appreciate knowing what the correct response is. The memo landed via the liaison chain on Tov's desk. He read it 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time because the 4th time he was reading it differently, not for content but for structure, for what it was doing. Adiinka had submitted something that was technically a request for guidance, which meant the Accord was obligated to respond. But it was also a fully documented evidentiary record that now existed in the official correspondence system, where it couldn't be quietly archived. And it ended with a question the Accord couldn't answer honestly without acknowledging that they knew about the Drevithi operation. She had built a trap out of bureaucratic procedure. Tove sent the memo to 5 separate divisions, which he was required to do by routing protocol, and added a note. This correspondence requires senior review. The Accord's response to the Karev Station incident, after the 14 months and the Joint Review Board, was a carefully negotiated restructuring of the Drevithi's commercial operating license. No criminal finding. No formal sanction. But the trafficking operation was quietly dismantled. The Drevithi's panel vote was temporarily suspended pending compliance review, and the Accord's Commercial Affairs Division issued new bioscan disclosure requirements for all Category 4 vessels operating in transit space. The new requirements were based almost entirely on the technical specifications of the Resolute's bioscan system. Nobody said this out loud. In the Communique to Humanity's Liaison Office, the Accord described the incident as a valuable example of cross-civilizational procedural cooperation. Vasquez read the communique in the Nairobi facility, with Tove sitting across from her. She said nothing for a long time. Valuable, she said finally. Yes. They're going to do it again, she said. Not the Drevithi specifically. But something like this. Some version of this. Tove looked at her. Yes. And when they do, she said, we'll be Category 4. Advisory panel. No voting rights. No authority to bring a formal complaint independently. Yes. So the real question, she said, is whether we get out of Category 4 before the next incident, or whether the next incident is what gets us out. Tove said nothing. He was thinking about his private archive, the 64 notes he had never sent. He was thinking about a pigeon in a parking garage, not moving, completely unafraid. He was thinking about what kind of species learns the rules from the inside. You should accelerate your reassessment preparation, he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in over a year. She nodded, slowly, the way she did when she was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. We already have, she said. The thing about the Bureau's assessment model, the one that had been used to classify 9,000 years worth of civilizations, was that it was retrospective. It was designed to measure what a civilization had already done. What structures it had built, what conflicts it had survived, what cooperative behaviors it had demonstrated across documented history. It was, in the words of the xenosociologist Dr. Amara Khoury, whose work would later be described by Tove as the document that should have changed everything, essentially a report card issued to civilizations that graded them on tests they had already taken. The problem with humanity was that humanity had been taking a different test. Khoury published her paper, initially as an internal UN document, later shared with the Accord's Assessment Division through the Liaison Channel, in the 4th year of the contact period. It was called Civilizational Stress Testing and the Limits of Retrospective Classification. It was 72 pages, densely cited, and it made an argument that seemed obvious in retrospect and had apparently never occurred to anyone at the Bureau. A civilization that has survived repeated near-extinction events does not emerge from those events unchanged. The standard assumption, that high-aggression civilizations represent an unresolved developmental stage, fails to account for civilizations in which the aggression index is itself a response to persistent external and internal threat conditions. In such cases, what the assessment model reads as instability may in fact represent a highly adaptive stress response architecture that has been selected for precisely because it works. In other words, human instability wasn't a bug. It was a record of a species that had been stress-tested beyond anything the Accord's model had been built to measure, and had survived every test. The Bureau's assessment division took 3 years to formally review the paper. Their response was measured, collegial, and gently dismissive. They noted that Khoury's framework was theoretically interesting but not yet supported by longitudinal data sufficient to revise existing classification criteria. Meanwhile, quietly the following things happened. In the 5th year of the contact period, the human scientific community, working from technical disclosures the Accord had provided as part of the standard Category 4 uplift package, achieved a working prototype of fold space navigation. The Accord's technology division estimated that a Category 4 civilization, starting from humanity's baseline, would typically require 60 to 90 years to develop this capability. Humanity did it in 4. When the Accord's technology liaison flagged this, the response from the Bureau was, again, measured. Humanity had clearly had undisclosed research in adjacent fields. The timeline was unusual but not inexplicable. No classification change was warranted. In the 6th year, the first permanent human settlement was established on Mars. It was not a research station. It was not a flag-planting exercise. It was an engineered habitat designed for multi-generational habitation, with closed-loop agricultural systems, a functioning legal framework, and a population of 1,200 that had been selected using criteria that several Accord analysts privately noted looked less like a colonial expedition and more like an ark. Humanity was apparently hedging. In the 7th year, the Accord's Counterintelligence Division, a body that technically didn't exist under that name but performed exactly those functions, flagged an anomaly. Across multiple Accord member species' diplomatic and commercial networks, there was a pattern of information access that had no obvious source. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was corrupted. Data that was technically accessible through legitimate means was being accessed. But in aggregate, the access pattern described a coherent research program. Someone was systematically mapping the Accord's internal structure. It took the Counterintelligence Division 8 months to trace it. They found nothing, which was itself the finding. Whatever the program was, it had been designed to disappear on contact, not by covering its tracks, but by working so completely within legitimate access protocols that there was no violation to cite, no breach to investigate, and no subject to sanction. Every single access had a plausible individual explanation. Only in aggregate did the pattern emerge. The analyst who wrote the summary report noted, in a sentence that would later be quoted extensively, "The only conclusion consistent with the evidence is that whoever designed this program understood how our detection systems work well enough to build a research architecture that is technically invisible to them." The Counterintelligence Division sat on this finding for 6 weeks. Then someone in the division ran a check on which Category 4 civilizations had been exposed to sufficient Accord system architecture to understand their detection protocols. There was only one. The finding went to Senior Review. Senior Review deliberated for a month. The formal response was, "No actionable violation has occurred. Monitor." Tove received a copy of the summary through channels and spent a long time staring at his private notes. He thought about Vasquez asking what the assessment criteria meant within the Accord's decision architecture. He thought about Adiinka's memo from Karev Station, built out of bureaucratic procedure like a ship built inside a bottle. He thought about Khoury's paper and the Bureau's polite dismissal and the 3-year review timeline. He thought about what it meant to be a species that had survived by learning systems from the inside, and then had encountered the largest system it had ever seen, and had spent 7 years doing exactly what it had always done. He wrote one more private note. I think we have been measuring the wrong thing. We have been asking what humanity has done. We should have been asking what humanity was preparing for. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not certain I want to. But I am increasingly certain that when the Bureau finally understands what they're looking at, their first instinct will be fear. And I am concerned about what they will do with that fear. He encrypted the note, added it to the archive, and began drafting a request for an expedited reassessment hearing. He submitted the request through official channels. It was assigned a review date 14 months out. He looked at that date for a long time. Then he booked a private transport to the Bureau's regional hub and began writing the speech he would give when he got there. The emergency session of the Accord's Senior Assessment Council was held in the 14th year of human contact, in the Bureau's regional hub above the Sarin system, the same system that housed Karev Station, which several observers would later note was almost certainly not a coincidence. The session had been called, nominally, to review a formal reassessment petition submitted by 3 member civilizations who cited the fold space navigation development as grounds for reclassification. In practice, it had been called because enough senior voices in the Accord had become sufficiently alarmed about the Intelligence Division's reports to demand a conversation that wasn't being filtered through administrative channels. Tove had not submitted one of the 3 petitions. He had, instead, spent 4 months talking to everyone who would talk to him, and what he had assembled was not a coalition so much as a persistent low-level alarm, a sense shared across enough senior members to matter, that something about the human situation required direct attention. The session lasted 3 days. The first day was testimony from the Intelligence Division, the Technology Liaison Office, and 3 independent xenosociologists, 2 of whom had read Curry's paper. The testimony was, by any objective measure, alarming. The fold space timeline. The Mars settlement. The information access pattern. A separate flag from the Bureau's commercial division noting that 3 human-adjacent corporations had, in the past 2 years, acquired minority stakes in Accord-registered shipping companies, all within Category 4 trade rights, all technically compliant, but in aggregate representing something that looked less like commerce and more like infrastructure acquisition. The second day was deliberation. This was where it got difficult. The difficulty was this. Nothing humanity had done was technically in violation of any Accord statute or treaty. Every individual action had a legitimate explanation. The fold space development was impressive but not prohibited. The Mars settlement was exactly what the uplift framework encouraged. The information access pattern was invisible because it used legal access protocols. The commercial acquisitions were compliant. What the Council was being asked to decide was not whether humanity had broken the rules. What they were being asked to decide was whether humanity was dangerous. And buried in that question, several Council members began to notice, was a subtler one. Dangerous to whom? Councillor Vetherin of the Velhari Home Delegation, a formidable politician who had voted against every Category 4 reclassification in her 30-year tenure on the grounds that civilizational uplift must follow demonstrated stability, not potential, was the one who said it out loud. We are not here because humanity has threatened anyone, she said. We are here because humanity has, in 14 years, mapped our systems, absorbed our technology, established off-world permanence, and done all of it without giving us grounds to sanction them. We are here because a Category 4 civilization has made us nervous, and I want us to be honest about what we do with that feeling. There was a long silence. Because if what we are proposing, she continued, is restricting a civilization's development trajectory not because they have caused harm but because they have caused anxiety, we should be very precise about what kind of accord we are choosing to be. The vote on the reassessment petition, which would have elevated humanity to Category 3 and given them voting rights on the Commercial Affairs panel, was 14 to 11 in favor. It failed. Reclassification required a 2/3 majority. There was no announcement. The session record was archived with a standard notation. The petition was listed as deferred pending further assessment. Humanities Liaison Office received a communique describing the session as ongoing review within normal assessment parameters. Tove was in the observation gallery when the vote was read. He watched the numbers appear and felt something he would have had difficulty naming, not quite dread, not quite shame. Something that lived in the space between understanding and helplessness. He thought about Vasquez's voice. The real question is whether we get out of Category 4 before the next incident, or whether the next incident is what gets us out. He took out his personal device and typed a message. It wasn't through official channels. He sent it to a private address he had established 18 months earlier, because he had thought this moment might come. The message was 3 sentences. The vote failed. They know something is coming, but they voted fear. 14 years of goodwill and correct behavior was not enough. I'm sorry. He sent it and sat in the gallery while the council members filed out around him, and thought about what came next. What came next arrived faster than he'd expected. The Drevithi had long memories, excellent lawyers, and a grudge. The Karev station incident had cost them their commercial operating license, their panel vote, and, though this was never formally documented, the quiet tolerance of the Accord's Commercial Affairs Division, which had decided in the aftermath of the incident that the Drevithi were more trouble than their vote was worth. None of this was humanity's fault, technically. The Drevithi had a different opinion. What they launched was not a war. The Drevithi were not a warrior civilization. They were merchants, and merchants, when aggrieved, used the tools of merchants: leverage, proxy, and deniability. What they launched was, in the language of Accord intelligence reports, a destabilization campaign targeting Earth's early off-world infrastructure. The Mars settlement supply chain was disrupted through a series of commercial maneuverings that were individually legal and collectively devastating. 3 separate shipping contracts were voided on technical grounds within 60 days of each other, leaving the settlement short of medical resupply by 14%. A human research station in the asteroid belt was denied refueling access at 2 successive Accord licensed stations on grounds that would have taken years to legally challenge. Several minority stake acquisitions by human-adjacent firms in Accord shipping were subjected to surprise regulatory audits that effectively froze the assets. It was elegant. It was vicious. It operated entirely within the Accord's commercial framework, which meant that humanity's Category 4 status gave them virtually no recourse. They could file complaints. They could request reviews. They could work through the liaison channel. The Drevithi had, very carefully, done to humanity exactly what humanity had done at Karev Station: used the system's own rules as the weapon. The difference was that at Karev Station, Adiinka had been trying to flag an injustice. The Drevithi were trying to cause one. Dr. Vasquez received the intelligence summary from Tove on a Tuesday. She read it once, set it down, and spent 4 hours in a closed meeting with the UN Secretary-General and 3 people whose names were not on any official roster but who had been working for approximately 12 years, on a project that was formally classified as deep contingency planning, and was in substance something else entirely. What emerged from that meeting was activated not as a diplomatic response, not as a commercial countermaneuver, but as something the Accord didn't have a classification for. Within 72 hours of the intelligence summary, the following things happened. The Mars settlement's medical supply shortfall was covered, completely within the week, through a logistics chain that didn't use any Accord-licensed shipping infrastructure. The vessels that delivered the supply were registered through a corporate structure that had been quietly assembled over 9 years specifically to operate outside Accord commercial jurisdiction while remaining technically compliant with all relevant treaties. No one had built this in response to the Drevithi. It had been built because humanity, somewhere around year 5 of the contact period, had begun to understand that Category 4 status meant vulnerability, and vulnerability required redundancy, and redundancy required infrastructure that didn't depend on anyone's permission. They had built a second supply chain. In secret. For a decade. The Asteroid Belt Research Station received refueling from a human vessel that had been en route for 11 days, meaning it had been dispatched 3 days before the refueling denials. Somehow. The logistics of this would later confuse Accord analysts considerably until they realized that the Resolute's bioscan anomaly at Karev Station had not been humanity's first intelligence operation in Accord space. It had been one of the more visible ones. And the regulatory audits targeting the commercial acquisitions encountered something unexpected. Documentation. Meticulous, complete, legally airtight documentation of every transaction, every compliance filing, every technical requirement, cross-referenced against Accord commercial law in 4 separate jurisdictions, prepared clearly well in advance of any audit, as if whoever had assembled it had known the audits were coming. Or had known they might come someday and had prepared for the day anyway. The Drevithi's campaign lasted 41 days. It ended not with a confrontation, not with a formal complaint, but with a quiet stillness, like a wave that had expected to hit a shore and instead encountered open water. There was nothing to break against. Every pressure point they had pressed had something behind it. The Accord's Intelligence Division produced a report. It was, again, measured. It noted that humanity's response to the Drevithi campaign had revealed previously undisclosed infrastructure and contingency architecture of significant scope. It flagged the advanced logistics as analytically inconsistent with real-time response capability, suggesting prior intelligence gathering. It also noted, in a section that circulated only at senior levels, that in 41 days of pressure against a Category 4 civilization with no voting rights and limited formal recourse, the Drevithi had achieved exactly nothing. The report's conclusion was brief: recommend immediate reassessment review. Tove read the report and thought about the first time he had arrived on Earth, about the 64 private notes, about Vasquez's careful questions and Adiinka's bureaucratic trap and Curry's paper about stress-tested civilizations. He thought about what it meant to watch something unfold exactly as you had anticipated it would and feel no satisfaction at all, only the sober weight of knowing you were right. He submitted his own addendum to the report. It was one paragraph. The Drevithi campaign was designed to exploit humanity's Category 4 status, their lack of formal recourse, their dependency on Accord-licensed infrastructure, their limited diplomatic standing. It failed because humanity spent the past decade building alternatives to every point of dependency we created. They did not do this in response to the Drevithi. They did it because, at some point in the past 14 years, they concluded that a system which could dismiss them could also be used against them, and they decided not to require our protection. We did not lose their trust. I'm not certain we ever had it in the way we assumed. The question the Council must now answer is not whether to reclassify humanity. The question is whether reclassifying them changes anything at all. He submitted the report and sat at his desk in the Nairobi facility for a long time, listening to the sounds outside: birds, distant traffic, the low hum of a city that had been building itself for millennia and was still, improbably, standing. There was something outside his window. He looked. A pigeon. Sitting on the ledge. Watching him with one orange eye. Not afraid. He thought about that footnote in Sarakai's first contact report. Local fauna display no fear response. He understood now what it meant. It wasn't desensitization. It wasn't ignorance of danger. It was something much older than that. Something that lived in the DNA of every creature that had survived on this improbable, violent, gorgeous planet long enough to stop being prey. The pigeon blinked once. Then it flew away. The second vote on human reclassification was not called an emergency session. It was called an annual strategic review, which was a normal item on the Accord's Senior Council calendar, scheduled 14 months in advance, attended by all 73 voting members. The agenda listed 17 items. Human reclassification was item 9. It passed 51-22. The announcement was made through standard channels. Humanity was elevated to Category 3. They received a voting seat on the Commercial Affairs panel. They received access to Category 3 information disclosures, which included a substantial body of technical and historical material that had been withheld under Category 4 restrictions. Secretary-General Adiz Okonkwo, who had, against all actuarial probability, won a second term and then a third, carrying with her a kind of moral authority that resisted the usual erosion of extended power, received the communiqué in the same office where, 15 years earlier, she had sat across from Esaveth and asked him about Category 3. She read it. She set it down. She called Vasquez. They voted us through, she said. I know, Vasquez said. I've been watching the council communications for 3 days. Legally? Yes. There was a pause. What do we have now that we didn't have before? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. A vote. Access to about 40 years of archived technical disclosures we weren't cleared for. Formal standing to bring independent complaints. And the ability to sit in the room when decisions get made. And what do we have now that they don't know we have? The pause this time was longer. Vasquez was many things, but she was not careless. 15 years of system knowledge built from the outside in, she said finally. Infrastructure they didn't build for us. Supply chains they don't control. An understanding of how they make decisions that we developed by watching them make them. And about 700 researchers across 12 institutions who've spent a decade doing what Curry described, learning what stress-tested civilizations learn. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Are we dangerous? It was the question Councillor Vetherin had asked in the session 15 years ago. Are we dangerous? And buried in it, the subtler one. Dangerous to whom? I think, Vasquez said carefully, that we are the thing they were afraid we were. But not the version they imagined. They imagined aggressive, impulsive, unstable. And instead, patient, Vasquez said. We're patient, and we learn. Tove attended the reclassification ceremony, which was not elaborate. A formal document exchange, a seat assignment, a registration update in the Bureau's archive. He stood near the back of the room and watched Vasquez accept the documents with the same careful forward-leaning attention she brought to everything. After the ceremony she found him. "Thank you," she said. "The addendum you submitted. The one about the question the council actually needed to answer." He looked at her. "It didn't change the first vote." "No. But it changed the framing for the second one. You told them the right question. That matters." He thought about his private archive. 71 notes now, accumulated over 15 years, never submitted, never shared, a record of everything he had understood that he hadn't known how to say through official channels. A record of watching something unfold and being inside the system that was trying to manage it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The contingency infrastructure. The second supply chain. The commercial architecture. The information access program." He paused. "Was any of it built for aggression?" She looked at him for a long time. The same dense, forward-leaning stillness he had never been able to fully read, even after 15 years. "No," she said. "All of it was built for the same reason." "Which is?" "To not need to be saved," she said. "To not be in a position where someone else's decision about our classification is the difference between our people surviving and not surviving. We didn't build it to threaten anyone. We built it because we've spent 10,000 years learning that if you want to still be here, you can't outsource that to someone else's goodwill." He thought about that for a long time. "The Bureau will be uncomfortable," he said, "with what humanity represents now. What you've shown is possible. Other Category 4 civilizations will watch what you did. They will ask why they couldn't do the same." "Maybe they should ask that," she said. "The Accord isn't designed for." "I know what the Accord is designed for," she said, not unkindly. "We've been studying it for 15 years. She looked at him. "The Accord was designed to manage civilizations that needed managing. We don't need managing. We need partners." She said it without aggression, without threat, without any of the sharpness the Bureau had been braced for. She said it the way she had said everything else, in all the years he had known her, with the clarity of someone who had thought further ahead than the current conversation and had chosen, very deliberately, which conversation to inhabit. He nodded slowly. "That will take time." "We know," she said. "We're patient." Outside the facility's wide windows, the Nairobi skyline was golden in the late afternoon light, towers and construction cranes and the distant suggestion of the savannah where something like humanity had first stood upright and looked at the horizon and decided that whatever was out there, they were going to walk toward it. Tove looked at that horizon. 15 years ago, a pigeon had sat unafraid on a ledge and watched him, and he had written it in a footnote because he hadn't known what it meant. He knew now. It meant, "We have been here a long time. We have seen everything that came before you. We are still here." It meant, "You are not the first thing we survived." It meant, "We are not afraid." He thought for the first time in a long time, that this might not be the beginning of a problem. He thought it might be the beginning of something else entirely. Somewhere in the Bureau's archive, in a file that would not be reviewed for another 30 years, there was a footnote in a 47-page report. It read, "Local fauna display no fear response to sapient contact. Possible indicator of endemic desensitization across species." It was, as it turned out, the most important thing in the document. The Accord had read it as vulnerability. It was the opposite of that. It always had been.